thank you for joining us. Thank you very much for being here today. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Wim Franćois. Professor Wim Franćois comes from the Catholic University of Leuven. He works in research projects at the Catholic University of Leuven in the School of Theology. We have worked together in some projects, some volumes that he has edited, together with other professors from the area of the Netherlands and Belgium. Professor Franćois, his main interest is the translation of the Bible in the early modern period, translations that were done in the University of Leuven. He has worked in this area. He has also worked on the area of martyrdom in the Low Countries. A very important scholar in this area, recognized throughout Europe, but especially in Belgium and the Netherlands. Professor Franćois is also editor of the new journal, Early Modern Christianity, which is just coming out. It's going to be published in Berlin. He's a part of the editorial board, and we're working together in that endeavor. He is coming to the States to present at the Renaissance Society of America, and he's going to be there, so he's leaving tomorrow morning for New York. But I decided to invite him to come to the School of Theology and be with us. I'm glad that you're here with us, but we're also recording his lecture, so we will have it available for students in our classes, and we will have it available online. Today he's going to talk about the Catholic Church and vernacular Bible reading before and after Trent. Trent is the great council that defined modern Roman Catholicism from the 16th century all the way really to the Second Vatican Council. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Roldan Figueroa, for this kind introduction. Thank you very much for giving me the occasion to be here to visit the faculty and to give a lecture. And this at the very moment that the President of the United States is in Belgium visiting, so let's consider this as an exchange.
I think we're the winners of that exchange.
We're the winners.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the attitude of the Catholic Church with regard to Bible reading in the vernacular has been subject to many misunderstandings and even prejudices. Often it has been stated that the Catholic Church was very reluctant towards, if not opposed to, the laity's reading of the Bible in the vernacular. This may, for example, be true with regard to the Roman authorities and their counter-Reformation reflex in the second half of the 16th century, but it should be considered a blunt and uncritical generalization when taking the entire late medieval and early modern church history into account. It is the aim of this lecture to draw a more nuanced picture of the Catholic position, starting with an overview of the various and often diverging local traditions that existed in late medieval Europe regarding Bible reading in the vernacular. In the second section, I will deal with the position the Council of Trent took with regard to vernacular Bible reading, culminating in the so-called Fourth Rule of the Tridentine Index of 1564. In the third section, attention will be given to the ever stricter position taken by the Roman authorities in the second half of the 16th century, as it was expressed in the succeeding versions of the Roman Index. And I will conclude with the Clementine Index of 1596 and the dramatic changes it provoked on the map of the prohibited or sanctioned areas of Europe as far as vernacular Bible reading was concerned. In relation to the Middle Ages, it should be emphasized that there was not a general Roman policy pertaining to Bible reading in the vernacular, let alone a ban, that could have been in force everywhere in Western Europe. In most regions or linguistic areas of Europe, first in manuscript and later in print, copies containing parts of the Bible were circulated and read. True, in most regions the practice and the limitations of vernacular Bible reading by the laity were debated But as a general rule, it was only in those areas where the church had to face popular dissidents that the ecclesiastical and civil authorities adopted a strict stance regarding Bible reading in the vernacular. In all places, the reasoning was that free reading of the Bible and an idiosyncratic interpretation of its content would inevitably lead to errors and even heresy. The most obvious example is England, where vernacular biblical material of all kinds circulated in the late Middle Ages without leading to any prohibitory measures. When, however, John Wycliffe and his followers, the Lollards, engaged from the 3070s on in a project of translating the text of the complete Bible with the purpose of giving it a broad readership, while at the same time promoting ideas of the self-sufficiency of the scriptures, in addition to other heretical ideas, the ecclesiastical authorities took measures. In the wake of the Oxford Synod of 1407-1409, convened by Archbishop Thomas Arundel, the so-called Oxford Constitutions were issued, forbidding any new translation of the Bible into English or any other vernacular language without the prior approval of the local bishop or a provincial council. Discussion still prevails as to what degree this ban was effectively enforced, especially given the large number of manuscripts, some 250, containing the Wycliffite or Lollard texts that are known to have survived and are preserved in libraries and archives. It has moreover been demonstrated that changes to the layout, such as the removal of Wycliffite paratextual material and the addition of the Old Testament readings from Mass to New Testament manuscripts, also made the copies acceptable to an Orthodox readership. Nevertheless, for about 130 years, from 1409 onwards, in principle, the mere possession of English books relating to the Bible by ordinary lay people could result in a charge of heresy. This situation is exemplified by the first English Protestant New Testament, edited by William Tyndale in successively Worms and Antwerp, which was immediately affected by prohibitory measures by the English authorities. This would continue until 1538, when King Henry VIII, having broken with the Church of Rome without, however, becoming a full-blooded Protestant, would allow an English Bible to be printed, the Great Bible of 1539. So given the importance of Anglo-Saxon historiography, the particular English situation was more than once extrapolated to the whole of Western Christianity and contributed to the spread of the ill-famed paradigm that the late medieval church prohibited vernacular reading by the laity. So then here you see a copy of the New Testament by William Tyndale, printed in Worms in 1526. In the southern part of what is now France, Occitan language biblical material circulated in both Orthodox and heterodox milieus, namely Waldensian and Cathar, as is evidenced by the extant manuscript material. Measures taken against the said groups, and especially against the Cathars, also included some serious reservations relating to Bible reading in the vernacular. This was, for instance, the case with pronouncements at the provincial councils of Toulouse in 1229 and 1246. If the production of vernacular biblical material was slowed down by such measures, it was certainly taken up again in the 14th century, when, and I quote, Catholic normality was fully resumed, end of quote, as Clive Snedden has formulated it in the New Cambridge History of the Bible. Waldensians were also to be found in more northern regions, especially in the French and German linguistic border areas. And when Bishop Bertram of Metz complained to Pope Innocent III of heretical groups being active in his diocese and convening, discussing, as well as preaching on the basis of French translations of the Bible, the Pope replied with a renowned letter entitled Cum ex Iuncto from 1199, among other documents. The Pope did not denounce vernacular Bible reading as such, but opposed secret religious conventicles, where the Bible was freely discussed, as well the practice of the ministry of preaching without any explicit ecclesiastical approval. Innocent III's Cum ex Iuncto has been included among the decretals of Gregory IX in 1234 and as such became part of the canon law of the Western Church. Adversaries of Bible reading in the vernacular have more than once invoked Cum ex Iuncto as an official papal ban on vernacular Bible reading, with a validity extending to the entire Western Church, although this was never the Pope's initial intention, as defenders of vernacular Bible reading did not hesitate to emphasize. Whatever the case may be, in the heart of France, north of the Loire, manuscripts containing parts of the Bible were produced in great quantities, such as history Bibles, in addition to liturgy-related works, such as vernacular psalters and books containing the Gospels and epistle readings from Mass. Close study of the original manuscripts has revealed that these biblical books were actually used and read by lay people of all social strata, and that they were even not inaccessible to the middle and lower classes living in an urban setting. A version of the so-called Bible historiale complétée, revised by Jean de Reuilly, the King's Confessor, was first printed circa 1496-99, with about 10 reprints before the beginning of the Reformation era, in addition to 2 printed New Testaments containing the text from the same Bible. In the very same period, 14 editions were printed of the Bible abrégée, an abridged history Bible, the first in 1473-74. Moreover, several books were printed containing the Gospel and epistle readings from Mass, accompanied with sermons and expositions, and reproducing textual material that went back to the late Middle Ages. However, one should not lose sight of the fact that among the members of the influential theological faculty of Paris, the opposition to vernacular Bible reading by the laity was on the increase. Confronted with the Bible-based heresy of Wycliffe and Jan Hus in its wake, as well as with free-thinking beggards in France and elsewhere, Jean Gerson, the chancellor of the Paris faculty and one of the most influential theologians of his time, implored the Council Fathers at Constance in 1417 to issue a prohibition on Bible reading in the vernacular that would extend to the entire Church. The Council, however, did not issue such a general prohibition, but Gerson's standpoint was taken up by his colleagues of the Faculty of Theology in Paris. And when Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples published in 1523 his new French translation of the New Testament, the faculty struck it with an official condemnation, first in August 1525 and again in February 1526. The Parlement de Paris officially confirmed the faculty's prohibitory measures. But the aforementioned Bible historiale complétée and Bible abrégée were not affected by the Paris condemnation of new translations and continued to be printed up until 1545-46. The first, some 20 additional editions printed, the second, 7 editions. It must nevertheless be admitted that the French culture of Bible reading did not receive an extra impetus from the humanist movement, as was the case elsewhere in Europe, and that it was even vulnerable to attempts of suppression. So no more new French translations of the Bible were printed until 1565. It was possible for Lefebvre's French Bible translations to be published, be it outside the sphere of the Paris theologians' influence in towns such as in Antwerp, in the Low Countries. The New Testament was published from 1525 onwards, the Old Testament in 1528, and the complete Bible from 1530 onwards. In Antwerp, not only were Dutch Bibles printed in the first decades of the 16th century, but also French Lefebvre editions, as well as English Tyndale New Testaments. In contrast to Tyndale's editions, however, Lefebvre's versions bore the consent of the Louvain Faculty of Theology, which, by so doing, gave an explicit approval where their Paris colleagues had issued a condemnation. It is another indication that on the eve of the Council of Trent, there was no univocal Catholic position as regards vernacular Bible reading, but only geographically and culturally diverse attitudes. An even more ambiguous picture can be observed in Spain and Catalonia. Considering the multi-cultural context of late medieval Spain, Gemma Avenozza, the author of the article in the New Cambridge History of the Bible, waxes lyrical about the possibilities of Bible reading in the said cultures. And I quote, "Hispanic peoples of diverse languages and nations read, handled, adapted, and translated the Bible. Christians, Jews, Albigenses, Waldensians, and other sects." End of quote. Given the presence of Jews in Castile, a large group of biblical, namely Old Testament texts, were translated from the Masoretic Hebrew for use by both Catholic, often noble readers, and members of the Jewish community. Other biblical texts were translated from the Latin Vulgate, such as those commissioned by King Alfonso X, the Learned, to be issued in his General Historia from circa 1270, 1284. General Historia, I think in Spanish, is it? Something like that. A kind of world history. In addition, there was also the famous Alba Bible from circa 1430. As in the other cultural areas of Europe, the Psalter and books containing the epistle and gospel readings of Mass were among the most often translated biblical texts in Castilian. Examples are the epistles and gospels by Gonzalo Garcia de Santa Maria, published in 1484-85, and the first printed edition of a biblical text in Castilian. As regards Catalan Bibles, only scarce manuscript material has been preserved. Noteworthy is the so-called 15th century Bible that has its origin in the Portacelli Charterhouse in Valencia and has incorrectly been ascribed to Bonifacio Ferrer. It was the basis for the first printed Bible, the Valencia Bible of 1478, as well as for a separate edition containing the Psalms from circa 1480, printed in Barcelona. But no complete copies of the Valencia Bible, or even of the aforementioned epistles and gospels by Gonzalo Garcia de Santa Maria, are extant. And this confronts us with another aspect of the Spanish vernacular Bible, namely that of a harsh oppression and even destruction of copies of the Bible. In northern Aragon, measures against vernacular Bible reading were already promulgated in 1233 by the Synod of Tarragona. This was part of a broader reaction against Waldensians and Cathars and Albigenses, who were also active in the region which was adjacent to the aforementioned southern French Occitania. Targeting the Begin movement, another synod in Tarragona issued in 1317 a prohibition of the possession of vernacular books in general. More important, however, is the second wave of opposition that the Spanish Inquisition unleashed against vernacular Bibles from the 15th century onwards. This repression formed part of a reaction against the remaining Jews in Spain, or against the conversos, Jews who had converted to Catholicism but whose loyalty to the faith was questioned. The prohibitions were intended to prevent Jews and conversos from clandestinely continuing their Jewish worship, from interpreting the scriptures according to their former Hebrew traditions, and thus from secretly initiating their children in the Mosaic law. From the midst of the 15th century onwards, massive burnings of copies of the Bible, both in Catalonia and Castile, are recorded. These actions culminated in a harsh prohibition of vernacular Bibles, obviously issued by the Inquisition in 1492 with the consent of the so-called Catholic kings Ferdinand and Isabella. Such measures by the Inquisition are said to explain the scarcity of extant copies of the Bible, both in manuscript and in print. Other editions, however, were published with the explicit consent of the Catholic kings in order to provide orthodox versions that were linked with the liturgy. This was preeminently the case with the Epistles and Gospels by Ambrosio de Montesinos, which were in fact a revision of those by Gonzalo Garcia de Santa Maria, first printed in 1512, and which went through several reprints, among other places in Antwerp. The same Bible policy was maintained by the Spanish Inquisition under Charles V when it came to taking measures against the upcoming Protestantism in Spain. In this context, Francesco de Encinas published the first Reformation-minded humanist version of the New Testament in 1543 outside Spain in, again, Antwerp. A very different picture arises on consideration of the situation in Germany. Building upon a manuscript tradition of centuries, German Bible texts became available for printing, so that between 1466 and 1522, thus before the Reformation, about 70 editions containing such books were printed. 18 of these 70 were pandects or complete Bibles, the first being the Mentelian Bible of 1466. True, there were efforts to prevent the vernacular Bible from falling into the hands of the uneducated, let alone heretical people, such as Charles IV's imperial prohibition of 1369 aimed at the Beguines, or Archbishop Berthold's attempts to stop the printing of vernacular religious works, and especially Bibles in Mainz in 1486, to mention only the most famous. But none of them were able to effectively impede the interest in vernacular versions of the scriptures in Germany among clerics, nobles, and literate townspeople. And when Martin Luther published the first version of his New Testament in 1522 and his complete Bible in 1534, he could rely on this century-long interest in vernacular Bible reading in Germany. It must even be admitted that his versions, especially that of the New Testament, preserve reminiscences of the older translation tradition, although Protestant historiography has emphasized the novelty and superiority of Luther's translations. And confronted with Luther's new translation, the Catholic Church in Germany did not react by imposing a strict ban on vernacular Bible editions, but by putting good Bibles into the hands of the people, namely Bibles where confessionally sensitive passages from the Luther Bible had been corrected on the basis of the Vulgate. The best known of these Catholic Korrekturbibeln are the New Testament of Jerome Amser from 1527 and the Bibles of John Dietenberger 1534 and John Eck from 1537. A similar picture is to be found in my country and the Low Countries. Several parts of the Bible, such as history Bibles, psalters, translations of the New Testament, gospel harmonies, as well as books containing the epistle and gospel lessons from Mass, were widespread by the end of the Middle Ages. A lot of the material was read by people living in semi-religious communities under the inspiration of the Devotio Moderna, or the modern devotion, which was a Netherlandish spiritual reform movement that had its origin in the same period as those of Wycliffe and Huss, but in contrast to the latter remained within the church. Part of the material was eventually printed, beginning with the so-called Delft Bible of 1477, which was in fact an Old Testament version without the Psalms. The edition was immediately followed in towns as Delft, Utrecht and Gouda by the supplementary printing of the epistle and gospel readings from Mass as well as psalters. And when the first editions appeared based upon the text of Erasmus and or Luther, mainly in Antwerp, The authorities in the Low Countries did not react with a general ban on vernacular Bibles. What was prohibited were in particular those Bible editions that contained prologues, marginal glosses, summaries above the chapters, and other paratextual elements that might influence the interpretation of the reader in a heterodox direction. The discussion in semi-clandestine gatherings or conventicles of the Bible's interpretation was also forbidden. But just as in Germany, the authorities were keen to provide the population with a trustworthy translation based upon the Vulgate and devoid of all interpretative glosses. This was, for example, the aim of the Dutch Vorsterman Bible, named after the Antwerp printer who published this Bible for the first time in 1528, as well as the already above mentioned French Bible of Lefebvre d'Etaples, printed by Martin Languereur in 1530. As regards Italy, it may be concluded that biblical texts in the vernacular also played a fairly important role in the devotional life of late medieval burghers, especially in Tuscany and in the northern regions. Many of these burghers may have been members of the religious confraternities that flourished in late medieval Florence, Siena, and other wealthy towns of Tuscany, and by extension in other parts of northern Italy. Here also the church authorities had no fundamental objections to the reading of the Bible in the vernacular by lay people. And building upon an important manuscript tradition, 16 printed editions of the Italian Bible, translated by the Camaldolese monk Niccolo Malerbi, first edition in 1471, were published before the Reformation, and another 11 would follow up until 1567, when the last Catholic vernacular Bible in Italy came on the market. Before the Reformation, 2 editions of a late medieval text of the New Testament and 2 containing the Psalms were also printed. The reform-minded Florentine layman Antonio Bruccioli was the first to publish a New Testament in 1530 and a complete Bible in 1532 that were said to be based upon the original Greek and Hebrew. But this did not cause the Catholic Church authorities to subsequently prohibit Bibles. On the contrary, the same mechanism that was observed at work in Germany and in the Low Countries also arose in Italy. 2 Dominicans from the Florentine San Marco monastery provided a Catholic translation, in fact a correction of Bruccioli's translation, namely Fra Zaccaria of Florence in 1536, the New Testament only, and Sante Marmocchino in 1538, complete Bible. In addition to Germany, the Low Countries and Italy, a similar tradition of permitting Bibles or parts of it in the vernacular for the readership of people who did not understand Latin existed, for example, in Poland, the Czech lands, and in Dalmatia, Croatia. So such was the situation on the eve of the Council of Trent. And the issue of Bible translations in the vernacular was brought to the attention of the Council Fathers during the preparatory meetings in the build-up to the 4th session during Lent in 1546, when the Fathers had to tackle, among other issues, the so-called abuses related to the use of the Scriptures. And although the adversaries of the latest reading of the Bible in the vernacular had the intention of having this practice included among the said abuses, they were opposed by a group who were in favor of lay reading. The adversaries were led by the Spanish Cardinal Pedro Pacheco, Archbishop of Jaén, who was assisted by his theological advisor, the Franciscan friar Alfonso de Castro. Most of the Council Fathers coming from Spain, they had a tradition, and even the few from France were said to tend toward this negative viewpoint. But several Council Fathers from Italy, but not by far all of them, may have been in favor of Bible reading in the vernacular. This group found an authoritative mouthpiece in no one less than the Cardinal Cristoforo Madruzzo, the Prince Bishop of Trent and host of the Council. It is obvious that adversaries and proponents of vernacular Bible reading kept each other in equilibrium at the Council of Trent, so that the Fathers, during the fourth solemn session of the Council on 8 April 1546, were not able to make a definitive pronouncement concerning vernacular Bible reading, and thus continued to leave any decision in this regard to local instances. The Council, however, did declare the Latin Vulgate to be the authentic version of the Scriptures for the Catholic Church, in the sense of its conformity to sound evangelical doctrine, so that in the wake of the Council, Catholic vernacular Bible versions had more than ever to be based upon the Vulgate. A decade after the Council of Trent not having made any pronouncement on Bible reading in the vernacular, and its leaving the decision to the local ecclesiastical and civil authorities, the adherents of a restrictive approach inevitably gained an increasing influence in Rome. This was undoubtedly due to the seemingly unstoppable success of Protestantism, to which the permissibility of Catholic vernacular Bibles had not proven to be a sufficient alternative. Among the hardliners was Gian Pietro Carafa, former head of the Holy Office of the Roman Inquisition, who, as Pope Paul IV, had ascended the throne of Peter in 1555. In 1559, during the so-called unfortunate recess of the Council that lasted for a decade, he had published an index of forbidden books that was prepared by the Inquisition and that was in principle applicable to the entire Church. In this document, a general stipulation is given that no edition of the Bible in the vernacular, nor any edition of the New Testament, should in whatsoever way be printed, purchased, read, or held in possession without the written permission of the Holy Office of the Roman Inquisition. It is clear that the Roman Inquisition sought to reserve the judgment of the case for itself. The aforementioned general stipulations were preceded by what was considered a non-exhaustive list, forbidding specific editions of the Bible and the New Testament from several linguistic areas in Europe. The extremely severe index gave rise to great concern within the Church and received no application whatsoever, so no application. Therefore, as early as February 1559, the Holy Office felt obliged to issue a moderation to it. An absolute prohibition was maintained on Bibles provided with heretical commentaries and marginal glosses. Religious men, non-priests, and even pious and devout lay people, but in no case women, not even sisters of female monastic orders, could obtain permission to read so-called good Catholic Bibles in the vernacular. Permission to read books containing the Gospels and epistles from Mass could easily be obtained by those requesting such permission. It is important to note that these authorizations could be given by the inquisitors and their deputies, but in addition, and I quote, in places where these inquisitors were absent, ubi ipsi sunt, also by the local bishops, and this was a significant opening in comparison to the centralizing tendencies exhibited by Paul IV. Paul IV's successor, the more humanist-minded Pope Pius IV, confirmed these moderating measures and granted even more authority to the local bishops in making decisions regarding the printing, reading, and possession of Bibles. Pius IV eventually delegated the drafting of a new index to the Council Fathers, whom he had reconvened in Trent after this unfortunate recess of the Council under Paul IV. The Index of Trent, prepared exhaustively by a committee of prelates at the Council, was ultimately promulgated after the closure of the Council by Pope Pius IV in 1564. 46? No, 46. No, 64. Eh?
64.
64. The Index of Trent has to be considered as a landmark in the Catholic Church's position with regard to vernacular Bible reading. I always confusing these ciphers because in my language it's different.
Same as in German, right?
Yeah. it is therefore that I like to be the ciphers pronounced in French, because it's like in the Anglo-Saxon languages. The fourth of the famous 10 reguli or rules that were included in the index asserted, among other things, that the unrestricted authorization to read the Bible in the vernacular had more disadvantages than benefits. When, however, no detrimental effect, but only an increase in faith and devotion was to be expected from Bible reading, an individual and written dispensation could be granted by the bishop or the inquisitor, who had to seek the prior advice of the parish priest or the father confessor. The translation had to be made by a Catholic author. The list containing forbidden Bibles and New Testaments that was to appear in the index of 1559 had been removed from this new index of 1564. The implementation of the fourth rule of Trent through national indices or via legislation imposed by provincial councils or diocesan synods was very diverse in the post-Tridentine Catholic world, and frequently common practice was more tolerant than legislation. However, only 7 years after the promulgation of the Tridentine Index, the new Pope, Pius V, formerly a member of the inquisitorial apparatus, already considered a revision of the index. To that aim, he appointed on 5 March 1571 a committee of cardinals, which a year later, on 13 September 1572, was converted into a genuine Roman congregation by Gregory XIII, the congregation of the Index. It would take about a quarter of a century before this new Roman index would see the light. But in the meantime, there was a tendency toward rigorousness. The Roman instances in charge of censorship, namely the Congregation of the Inquisition, the Congregation of the Index, and the Master of the Sacred Palace, took successive measures that were aimed at imposing a strict prohibition on the reading of all kinds of vernacular biblical material. Not only bare translations of the Bible, but among others also psalters and books containing the epistle and gospels read at Mass. This was a deliberate return to the strict regulations of the first Roman Index of 1559, abolishing de facto the fourth rule of the Tridentine Index, and thus the right of bishops and local inquisitors to grant permission for the reading of vernacular versions of the Bible. On the contrary, they were urged to seize such editions and to consign them to the flames. It is important to emphasize, however, again, that these measures only found implementation in Italy, where the Roman Inquisition had elaborated an important network and where it managed to destroy an age-long tradition of vernacular Bible reading. After 15 years of preparations for a new index in 1587, the new Pope, Sixtus V, restructured the congregation of the index, bringing in more pastorally minded clerics, who proved to be in favor of once again allowing good Catholic vernacular Bible versions, or parts thereof, and of reconfirming the local bishops and inquisitors' right to judge whether or not individual readers in particular contexts might be permitted to read this vernacular biblical material. In other words, the congregation of the Index favored a reinstatement of the fourth rule of the 1564 Tridentine Index. As a consequence, the following decade was characterized by an invisible tussle of war between the congregation of the Index, the powerful congregation of the Inquisition, which continued to favor a rigorous Bible policy, and the Pope, choosing the one or the other side dependent on his personal convictions. In 1590, after having dismissed the advice of the tolerant congregation of the Index, or relatively tolerant congregation of the Index, Pope Sixtus V promulgated the third index of forbidden books, which may be referred to as the Sistine Index, given the fact that the Pope had managed to impose his own views. As regards Bible translations in the vernacular, the seventh rule, which was intended to replace the fourth rule of Trent, adopted a strict stance. Not only vernacular Bible editions themselves, but also parts of them were forbidden in principle, and permission could only be granted by the Holy See. After the death of Sixtus V, the 1590 Index was withdrawn by decree of the Congregation of the Inquisition, although it confirmed the strict stance with which it's sided as regards Bible reading in the vernacular. In 1593, a fourth index was approved by the humanist-minded Pope Clement VIII, which reinstated the fourth rule of Trent. But as soon as the cardinals of the Inquisition had inspected it, they managed to have Pope Clement VIII withdraw the index. It was precisely the Pope's reversion to a more lenient Bible policy the cardinals contested, as well as his allowing the local bishops to grant individual permissions for Bible reading in the vernacular. And after these two aborted attempts to have a new index published, Pope Clement VIII promulgated in March 1596 the fifth index of forbidden books, which again provided a reinvigoration of the fourth rule of Trent. However, the Congregation of the Inquisition again managed to force the Pope to suspend his own index, which had already been sent to all corners of the Catholic world, and to include a so-called Observatio Circa Quartam Regulam. This observation regarding the fourth rule not only bluntly revoked the local bishops and inquisitors' right to allow the purchasing, reading, or possession of vernacular versions of the Bible or parts of it by individual lay people requesting that favor, but also extended the prohibition to summaries and compendiums containing historical matter taken from the scriptures. The Clementine Index was promulgated in its definitive version on 17 May 1596. The 1596 Clementine Index did not, however, have the same impact in all parts of Europe, but resulted in a reshaping of the geography of vernacular Bible reading, as the distinguished Parmenese historian Gigliola Fragnito has demonstrated. In Italy, the publication of vernacular Bibles had for 3 decades already ceased, and many copies of the Bible and of Bible-based devotional works had been seized and consigned to the flames at the instigation of the Roman Inquisition. In the wake of the Clementine Index, cardinals and bishops from everywhere in Italy, as well as interested printer editors in Venice, induced, however, the more moderate congregation of the Index and its prefect, the Cardinal Agostino Valier, to negotiate with the Pope and with the Holy Office of the Roman Inquisition, so that finally several exemptions to the harsh prohibition could be obtained. A few months after the promulgation of the Clementine Index, authorization was granted for the reading of editions of the epistles and gospel lessons of Mass, subject to license by the bishop or the inquisitor, with the proviso that they were accompanied by comments written by authors of unquestionable orthodoxy. Under the same conditions, vernacular psalters, provided with good commentaries, were also permitted. These were texts against which there was traditionally the least opposition. Translations of the bare text of the scriptures or parts of it continued to be strictly forbidden. In addition to Italy, Portugal seems to be the only country where the Clementine Index was unconditionally implemented. In Spain, the index was not introduced, but the Spanish Inquisition maintained the already century-long reticence regarding Bible reading in the vernacular. As a consequence, the picture emerges that the Mediterranean countries, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, were the countries where Bible reading in the vernacular became strictly prohibited. In the countries of Northern and Central Europe, where the Catholics had to face the constant allurements of a Bible-centered Protestantism and had to be able to adduce biblical arguments when entering into controversy with the Reformers, a different strategy was adopted. Resistance against Rome's harsh ban on vernacular Bible editions induced the papal nuncios in the northern and central European countries to negotiate large exemptions of the said prohibitions. In the years following the promulgation of the Index, the Pope Clement VIII himself gave permission for the printing of a Bible in the Czech language that was in the process of being finalized for use in Bohemia, as well as for the further circulation of the aforementioned German Korrekturbibel, Polish Catholic Bible translation, and 4 Hungarian translations. In 1599, a revised version of the standardized Dutch Catholic Bible version was published in Antwerp. The English situation is particularly interesting. Cardinal William Allen, the leader of the English Catholics and member of the Congregation of the Index, deemed the translation of the scriptures in the vernacular necessary, legitimate, and even helpful to the Catholic missionaries who were to be sent to England to preach the Catholic faith, and by extension useful to the faithful themselves, and who were to respond to the Protestant doctrines. The English New Testament, translated by Gregory Martin in Reims, was ready by 1582. The Old Testament was added in 1609-10 after the return of the English College to Douai. The so-called Douai-Reims version, as you may know, was to become the official English language Catholic Bible for the centuries to come. And it is in particular due to the nuncio in Switzerland, Giovanni della Torre, that the resistance of the Northern and Central European Catholics against Rome's harsh Bible policy was brought unremittingly to the attention of the Center, so that the Congregation of the Index, at the request of the Pope, made a definitive settlement. The Catholics who lived in countries where they, due to the stipulations of civil law, had to live side by side with so-called heretics, were no longer supposed to be subject to the observation to the fourth rule attached to the Clementine Index, but in the years 1603-1604 were re-granted the principal right of reading vernacular Bible editions. In this sense, they were to be armed against the allurements of Protestantism and its interpretation of the Bible. For France and Germany, two of the most important European areas where Catholics and Protestants lived in close proximity to each other, the need for a new and trustworthy translation based upon the Sixth Clementine Vulgate of 1590-1592 was voiced. The Catholics' right to read the Bible should of course be understood as being dependent on the bishop's permission, and in this sense as a return to the regime imposed by the original Regula Quarta of the Tridentine Index. And the Congregation of the Inquisition had to accept, willing or unwilling, the fait accompli. So, looking back to the aforementioned evolution, we find that the Roman dispensation for Bible reading in the vulgar tongue, in the wake of the publication of the Clementine Index, was certainly applicable to those Catholics living in Germany, Switzerland, the Low Countries, Bohemia, Poland, Hungary and Dalmatia, where as far as possible a long-standing tradition of vernacular Bible reading continued to be upheld. It must, however, be observed that the production of Catholic vernacular Bible was, in several countries, on the decrease in comparison to the first half of the 16th century. On the other hand, the controlled access to vernacular Bibles was now extended to the Catholics of the British Isles and France, for whom it was in a certain sense a return to the prevailing attitude of a particular period of the Middle Ages that had been more open toward Bible reading, before the struggle against heresies had given occasion to, respectively, prohibition or reticence toward lay reading of the naked text of the Bible in these regions. The Catholics in the Mediterranean countries of Italy, Spain and Portugal were, however, largely deprived of vernacular Bibles, which implied, especially for Italy, a dramatic rupture with a long tradition of lay people having easy access to Bible texts in the vernacular. And the conclusion must inevitably be that the growing reluctance toward Bible reading in the vernacular was not due to the fourth session of the Council of Trent of 1546, and not even to the Tridentine Index of 1564, but to the Counter-Reformation reflex that had taken possession of several authorities within the Catholic Church during the course of the 16th century, and that had led to their distrust of vernacular Bible reading as a spiritual exercise, one that had came precariously close to Protestant practice. Such an attitude should, however, in no way be generalized or applied to the entire history of early modern Catholicism, let alone to that of the medieval church. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor François. We want to entertain some questions, but I do have a question for you. So, in your presentation, the first part where you did the geography, right? You discussed basically Western Europe,
Yeah.
and then Eastern Europe came up later on in the presentation. But there is a kind of resurgence right now of scholarship related to vernacular translations in Eastern Europe. Could you summarize that scholarship now, briefly?
Yeah, very, very briefly. As you may know, so this scholarship is only taking off now. But in Poland, there was, of course, also a very important tradition of Bible reading in the vernacular, and also after the Council of Trent, you had this confessionalization of Bibles in Poland. You had the Reformed Bibles, the Lutheran Bibles, and Catholic Bibles. The Czech lands, so we cannot consider the Czech lands as Eastern Europe, it's Central Europe, but the Czech lands were among the first areas in Europe to have vernacular Bibles. So also in Croatia, Dalmatia, you have this old tradition of reading Bibles in the vernacular. So there was in fact a tradition, most importantly in the Czech lands, but also in Poland, Dalmatia, Croatia, and so on. And as regards the Orthodox lands, of course, there is a complete different tradition. So they, let's say, the Slavonic, the Slavic-speaking Orthodox lands had no vernacular Bibles at all. In the late Middle Ages, early modern era. In Romania, I'm somewhat familiar with the situation in Romania. There, because it's not a Slavic language, there it's a Roman language, Romania, so they started earlier with making vernacular Bibles. First in manuscript, and then only in the 17th century they had their first printed Bible in Romanian, so before most other Orthodox countries. But in particular in the Germanic lands and, let's say, adjacent lands, the Low Countries, the Czech lands, and so on, you have this very important tradition. And of course you have also the Scandinavian countries, and also their research, astonishingly, research has not very much permeated to our research group. So we hope one day that we can open our research also to Scandinavian countries, because there also at the end of the Middle Ages there seems to be the first projects, and then humanist impetus, Reformation impetus. So the Scandinavian countries is also a very interesting topic, and I know there is now a research project in Sweden, Stockholm. So really researching this vernacular Bible issue in Scandinavia.
Very good. Now, the other question that I have for you here, or is a comment. It's interesting, in the case of Spain, of course, I've been working with it for a time, but they just recently published this massive catalog of books that were published in the 16th century, Libros Ibéricos, Iberian books. And in the statistics, they show that the editor shows that in terms of religious books, they have the same percentage of all books produced early in the 16th century, and towards the end of the 16th century, of all books produced, it's roughly like some 45% of all books are religious books.
Mhm.
So in those works that were also vernacular, they were not affected, but biblical translations were.
Yeah, that's what you see in a lot of, let's say, Catholic countries, also in the Low Countries. At the end of the 16th century, you have this switch in taste among the Catholic population, a switch in taste as regards spiritual, catechetical, devotional material. So their interest was not anymore in the first place to biblical text, but devotional texts of another kind. And this was sustained, of course, by the publishing program of printers as Christopher Plantin in Antwerp. This was a kind of, simply Bible reading in vernacular was not prohibited as such, but it was something that had turned to be on the Protestant or Protestantizing side. And people took their refuge to other devotional and spiritual books. Some of these books were beautifully edited by Plantin in Antwerp and sustained by the Jesuits. But you see this switch, let's say, in reading taste, also among the Catholic population in the Low Countries. Maybe in contrast to Spain, there was more room for vernacular Bibles. But anyway, at the end of the 16th century, the last 3 decades of the 16th century, no Bible was issued anymore, no complete Bible was issued anymore in the Low Countries in Dutch. The last edition was 1566, complete Dutch Bible, and the next was 1599, 33 years later. New Testaments, this production was continued long until the 1570s, when most of these towns in the Low Countries turned into Calvinist republics. And after these Calvinist republics were reconquered by the Duke of Parma, you see that these vernacular New Testaments were not taken up again to be reprinted. So this can also be kind of self-censorship. There wasn't, I'm not aware of any document that prohibited Bibles in the Low Countries. But you have this mixture of self-censorship, change of taste towards religious lecture, sustained by Jesuits and other religious congregations, and of course also implemented by the printers, publishers as Christopher Plantin in Antwerp. So there were also other strategies. It was not only a top-down, so here is the Inquisition, or here is the Pope, and that is the prohibition. There were different strategies working that made that vernacular Bibles, at least in Low Countries, were not forbidden, but it turned to the Protestantizing or Protestant side, and it was not seen as as a good.
That's very good.
I was just wondering, your study also has led into something that is sort of outside, but it was definitely influenced by these prohibitions and all that. In the case of Portugal and Spain, you have the 2 colonizers, main colonizers of the Americas, which made the American, the Catholic churches of the Americas essentially places where the common folk could not read the Bible, did not read the Bible in general. And I think a sort of a byproduct of that was the low literacy in those countries. And it's interesting that in general, up to a point, I don't know recently, but in the early part of the 20th century, you could almost count on the fact that Protestants had a higher literacy than Roman Catholics, partly because they wanted to read the Bible, which they could read, while Catholics didn't have incentives necessarily to read the Bible, not religious incentives to read the Bible.
Yeah.
Now, did that prevail also in Europe, in that the Mediterranean countries have a lower literacy than the Middle Europe and Scandinavia?
In Italy, there's a whole school with, let's say, secular Italian historians who argue in this direction, indeed, that this prohibition of reading the Bible in the vernacular, not only the bare text of the Bible, but also biblical material of all kind, that this meant a hard struck for the Italian culture as such, and threw it back, because at the end of the Middle Ages, Italian burghers in Tuscany, in Florence, in Siena, and in northern Italy, they copied their own Bibles. They made family Bibles of it. They copied other religious texts in it. There was really a very well developed biblical culture, especially in northern Italy, in Tuscany, in these beautiful towns, well-educated, among the well-educated townspeople there. And there is indeed, as regards Italy, I know that the theory exists, that this really meant a harsh struck for the Italian culture. This impact of the prohibition on readership, on consciences of people, and so on. Maybe that can be
And it is, for Spain too, there is a school of thought.
Yeah.
It is a hot debate, really, for Spaniards and Spanish scholarship, whether these kind of prohibitions affected literary production and even the development of science in Spain. But what you point is, for me, is even more challenging. What kind of impact did this have in the possessions or the colonies or the lands that were conquered?
Right.
Because they do produce catechisms. They do produce. There is a lot of devotional literature produced in Mexico and in Peru. But now that you bring the point, I do not know of the publication of Bibles, 16th, 17th, or even 18th century in.
The literacy movements, you know, we were mentioning earlier, Gustavo Gonzalez, and the father worked for Laubach. Each one teach one, and you know, the Protestants flocked to the literacy project.
This is true. Yeah, I mean, that was a project of literacy, and they used the Bible, and in Texas they did that too.
So,
but in the Spanish conquest process after the Conquista, they did force the indigenous population to learn the Bible. They didn't read it directly, but they had to learn catechism, they had to memorize it.
Well, that's the thing. They so I have to check here, but I'm almost certain that whatever biblical literacy was transferred to the indigenous population was by means of catechisms. So in these catechisms, not Bible reading as such.
Not reading directly, but I think, you know, one of the positive things, I'm always looking for the positive. I mean, probably it provided the space for these indigenous communities to find their own symbols. I mean, I'm thinking immediately that, for example, that Our Lady Guadalupe, that emerges as an accepted symbol. I mean, that then becomes an alternate text in this sense. So it provided the positive would be something like providing their own symbols and meanings.
Yeah, but indeed, with regard to literacy, for instance, in the Low Countries, you said they have taken away the Catholics' Bible, but something came in instead of it, and these publications that came from the presses in Antwerp, these are beautifully edited publications made by Jesuits with sometimes a very pedagogical idea behind it. So I'm not sure what the mechanism is, I'm not sure, but I know there is anyway in Italy, and I hear that in Spain, that there is a school, Wim Franćois is among them, which says, and it's more broadly than only the Bible, that the oppression by the Roman Inquisition with regard to reading, and also the oppression with regard to the consciences of people was a harsh blow for the culture there in Italy.
Yeah, Franco, do you have a question?
Yeah, when you mentioned the devotion moderna, I always curious about how was that movement affect especially the mystics of the 16th century in Spain. Are they a kind of subproduct of that, or?
We can bring you for another lecture.
Yeah. But Devotio Moderna was end 14th century, of course, and part of a broader pan-European movement of spiritual renewal. And in the Low Countries, Devotio Moderna was in fact a reaction against intellectualism in religion, scholastic theology, against superstition that was propagated by some layers of the clergy, not all, some layers of the clergy, all kind of exaggerations. So they wanted to go back to the sources and imitate Christ, follow Christ in his life, his passion and resurrection. So it was an ascetic movement, but they wanted to go back to the sources of Christianity, so they wanted to go back to the Bible, to the church fathers, to the fathers of the desert. And so Bible reading in general was very important for them. And this were especially semi-religious communities, so men and women who went to live in semi-religious communities, not, let's say, taking explicit vows, but doing their spiritual exercises. And among this group, a kind of tendency towards cloisterization started at a certain moment. Tertiaries accepted a certain rule and so on, and it is especially among these tertiaries. Tertiaries of St. Francis, for instance, in Utrecht, in the northern part of the Low Countries, that these vernacular Bibles were spread. So tertiaries of St. Francis in these religious communities inspired by the Devotio Moderna, but also, for instance, among lay brothers in the monasteries of Canons Regular, belonging to the congregation of Windesheim, and so on. So it started, let's say, as a lay movement, but lay people who went to live together in semi-religious communities, and then, of course, the church actively stimulated the kind of cloisterization of these lay people, and in these circles these Bibles were read. And by extension also among the burghers in the towns. But especially in these semi-religious communities, begins tertiaries of St. Francis and so on, and by extension also to townsburghers. How, of course, this influenced 16th century mystical Spain, I'm not sure about it, but Ignatius of Loyola was educated in Paris in the Collège de Montaigu, which was in fact also influenced by, let's say, a late development of the Devotio Moderna. Also Erasmus was educated there, and a lot of people. But also Ignatius of Loyola.
Well, if you go back in your presentation, you mentioned one New Testament translation early in the 16th century. The translator is a representative of the Devotio Moderna in 16th century Spain. If you can go back.
Garcia de Santa Maria?
Yes. And so right there. Ambrosio de Montesinos. Montesinos. So representative here, and so there were Fray Francisco de Osuna the author of the Third Spiritual Alphabet, published in the 1520s. Also a point of connection with Devoción Moderna, early 16th century Spain.
Yeah.
Somebody who was read by Saint Teresa.
Yeah, because of course the Low Countries and Spain were in fact the same country. So Charles V was the king of Spain, and was also emperor.
Holy Roman Emperor.
The Holy Roman Empire, was also sovereign of the Low Countries, and there were a lot of links, of course. So, and a lot of these epistlas evangelios were printed in Antwerp. This John Stalesius in Antwerp was a printer in Antwerp specialized in Spanish production.
Now I didn't know. I knew of Montesinos, but I did not know of this translation.
Oh,
this
yeah.
is brand new for me.
But it's a revision of this older gospel and epistle lessons of the Mass, an older from the 15th century. It's a revision that he made. So he's a reviser of an older translation.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.